Ricky Nelson died thinking he had nothing left. The fame was fading. The money was gone. His marriage had ended and the spotlight had moved on. When that old plane went down on New Year's Eve 1985, Ricky's story seemed to end in silence. He was only 45, and what he left behind wasn't what anyone expected. There were rumors of debt, a missing will, a fiancée cut out completely, and for children, grieving, confused, and left with more questions than answers. What came next? No one saw coming, because somewhere in the middle of that heartbreak, something was uncovered. And what Ricky Nelson's kids did after his death left fans in tears. In the final months of Ricky Nelson's life, it was hard to tell where the stage ended and the struggle began. To fans, he was still the boy next door with the perfect smile, the teen idol who grew up on television, sang his heart out on vinyl, and seemed like he belonged to every American living room. But behind that image was a man who had been quietly unraveling for years. And by the winter of 1985, Ricky Nelson was running on fumes. His marriage to Kristen Harmon, once celebrated as a Hollywood fairy tale, had long since fallen apart. What began as a whirlwind romance ended in a 5-year legal war. It drained Ricky financially and emotionally. The divorce settlement had cost him over $1 million, but the real price was something deeper: joint custody of their 4 children and a future shadowed by bitterness. The weight of that heartbreak never quite lifted. To survive, Ricky turned to the one thing that had always been there for him: touring. It wasn't the arena-packed stardom of his youth anymore. These were smaller venues, county fairs, amusement parks. Some nights the crowds cheered. Other nights they barely looked up. But Ricky kept going. He had to. Not just to pay the bills, but to feel like he still mattered. By late 1985, Ricky was planning a New Year's Eve performance in Dallas. It was supposed to be the start of something new. A clean break, a sign that maybe the worst was behind him. He had with him his fiancée, Helen Blair, a young and loyal presence in his life who had been by his side through the turbulence. Along with his band and crew, they boarded a vintage 1944 Douglas DC-3 airplane, once owned by Jerry Lee Lewis. Ricky had bought it thinking it would give him more control over his travel schedule and save money in the long run. But the plane had a reputation. The engines had problems. It had been pushed off runways before. Friends and bandmates begged him to stop flying it. But Ricky refused to cancel shows. He couldn't afford to. December 31st, 1985. The plane left Alabama, headed for Texas. Somewhere in the air over DeKalb, something went wrong. Smoke began to fill the cabin. Thick, fast, blinding. The pilots struggled to see, to breathe, to fly. Witnesses on the ground saw the plane dip, trailing black smoke before clipping trees and erupting into flames. Came down just 2 miles from the landing strip. There were 7 people in the back. None of them survived. Ricky Nelson died instantly, along with Helen and 5 members of his band and crew. He was 45 years old. The news hit like a punch. Fans who had grown up watching him on the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, who had slow danced to Poor Little Fool and smiled through Travelin' Man, suddenly found themselves mourning not just a singer, but a piece of their own past. For many, it felt like a light had gone out, not just in music, but in memory. In the days that followed, the tributes poured in. Magazine covers, candlelight vigils, radio retrospectives. But behind the headlines, something else was taking shape, something far less comforting. Because when the dust settled and the public moved on, Ricky's family discovered that what he left behind was more complicated than anyone imagined. And for his children, the pain was only just beginning. In the days after Ricky Nelson's death, the grief felt overwhelming. But what came next stunned even those closest to him. There was no roadmap, no instructions, no public farewell. At first, it was believed Ricky had died without a will. And in the chaos of sudden loss, that kind of silence wasn't just painful, it was dangerous. Ricky's ex-wife, Kristen Harmon, stepped forward almost immediately. As the mother of his 4 children, and a Hollywood name in her own right, she petitioned the court to take control of his estate. She claimed there was no documented will, and that the children, still reeling from their father's death, needed protection and stability. But others weren't so sure. Then, just as Kristen was preparing to move forward, a document surfaced. Ricky's brother, David Nelson, his childhood co-star and lifelong confidant, produced what appeared to be a legally valid will, dated just 4 months before the crash. Suddenly, everything changed. The will named Ricky's 4 children, Tracy, Gunnar, Matthew, and Sam, as his only heirs. David was appointed executor. Kristen, his former wife, was left out entirely, and so was someone else. In 1981, a court-ordered blood test had confirmed something Ricky had quietly tried to deny. He had fathered another child, Eric Jude Crew, the son of a brief relationship with a woman named Georgianne Crew. Ricky had paid child support for a short time, but the relationship was distant. The child was barely acknowledged publicly, and in the will he was written out. Ricky claimed in the document that paternity was disputed, despite the test results. The message was clear. This boy, his son, would receive nothing. When the will became public, Georgianne filed a claim on behalf of her child. It was heartbreaking and controversial. Some fans defended Ricky's decision. Others were shocked. How could the man they grew up loving leave a child behind? The court upheld the will. Eric Jude was denied a share of the estate. But that was only part of the problem. At the time of his death, Ricky Nelson's finances were a mess. Despite selling millions of records, his estate was reportedly in over $1 million of debt, the result of years of lavish spending, legal bills from his divorce, and the cost of maintaining that aging DC-3 aircraft. There were mortgages, taxes, and unpaid fees. The plane that killed him had been a last-ditch effort to cut costs, and it ended up costing him everything. Then came the lawsuits. Helen Blair's parents, devastated by the loss of their daughter, filed a wrongful death suit. Other families joined them. Creditors lined up. There were rumors that Ricky still owed money to his tour crew. And Kristen Harmon wasn't finished either. She challenged David Nelson's role as executor and pushed for part of Ricky's life insurance payout. Despite their divorce, the headlines faded, but the legal chaos behind the scenes kept growing. The Nelson children, some still teenagers, were caught in the middle. They were mourning their father while watching his legacy slip through their fingers. At one point, it looked like there'd be nothing left to inherit. Just memories, heartbreak, and court fees. But buried deep beneath the debts and dysfunction, there was something no one had noticed. Not yet. And what the Nelson children would eventually uncover years later would change everything. For years after Ricky Nelson's death, the public assumed what the headlines had told them, that Ricky died broke. He had been a teen idol, yes, a television star, a chart topper, but by 1985 most believed the fortune was gone. The plane, the legal fees, the divorce, everything had chipped away at the life he built. Even his own children were told there might be nothing left. But something didn't add up. If Ricky Nelson had sold over 60 million records in his lifetime, where did all that money go? That question lingered, quietly, in the background. For a while, no one had the strength to ask it. His children were grieving. Legal bills needed to be paid. David Nelson was doing what he could to hold the estate together. But behind the curtain, something strange was happening. Checks weren't coming in. Royalties were vanishing. And when the estate finally had time to breathe, to look into the numbers, what they found left everyone stunned. Record companies had been underpaying Ricky Nelson for decades. Some of it was easy to miss. Tiny deductions, outdated contract terms, vague adjustments no one had explained. But it added up and it didn't stop. One of the biggest culprits was Capitol Records. And when the estate started pushing for answers, what they found was a maze of corporate accounting tricks that made Ricky's earnings almost impossible to track. Things like breakage fees, once used to cover damaged vinyl records, were still being deducted, even on digital downloads. They were charging for CDs that didn't exist. The estate's legal team started digging deeper. The more they uncovered, the more outrageous it became. Capitol had been placing Ricky's digital income into a general account labeled unmatched revenue, a holding bin for money that supposedly couldn't be tied to any artist. But Ricky Nelson's music wasn't obscure. His name was on the records. His songs were clearly generating income. So where was it all going? In 2011, the estate had had enough. A lawsuit was filed against Capitol Records, demanding between $100 and $250 million in unpaid royalties. The claim was simple. Ricky Nelson's music had been generating real money, and the people in charge of protecting it hadn't. But Capitol wasn't the only one. As digital streaming became the new normal, another issue emerged: international royalties. The estate noticed massive deductions in earnings from overseas platforms, especially from Sony Music. Their contracts revealed a system where Sony's own branches were charging internal distribution fees, as if passing Ricky's music from one office to another justified cutting the payout again and again. The result? Some payments to the estate were being slashed by up to 68% before a single dollar was seen. The Nelson children weren't lawyers. They weren't accountants. But they knew their father had worked too hard and given too much for his name to be treated like this. So they fought, quietly, relentlessly. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't public. But over the years, they kept showing up, filing documents, reviewing statements, asking the uncomfortable questions no one wanted to answer. In 2014, the lawsuit against Capitol was settled. The details were kept confidential, but insiders say the numbers were substantial. And in 2020, Sony Music settled too. That case ended in a $12.7 million payout, plus a significant increase in streaming royalties for the estate moving forward. The man who died thinking he had nothing left had been making money all along. He just never knew it. And now, thanks to the children who refused to let him be forgotten, Ricky Nelson's name was finally being made whole. Long after the headlines faded and the lawsuits moved behind closed doors, Ricky Nelson's children were still fighting. But this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about their father's name, what it meant, what it stood for, and what the world had forgotten. To millions, Ricky Nelson was frozen in time. The fresh-faced teen on Ozzie and Harriet. The heartthrob who crooned Lonesome Town. The polished pop star who once rivaled Elvis in chart dominance. But to his kids, Tracy, Gunnar, Matthew, and Sam, he was something else. He was Dad. He was the man who drove them to school between tour stops. The man who sang lullabies that were never recorded. The man who struggled, failed, tried again, and never gave up. And they remembered the way he looked in those final years, not defeated but tired. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of fighting for relevance in an industry that had forgotten him. Tired of smiling through shows when the money never showed up. Tired of wondering if all those songs he poured his soul into would be remembered at all. That's why they fought. After Ricky's death, there was no roadmap. There was grief, debt, silence. The music industry moved on, and for a while so did the fans. But Ricky's children stayed. Behind the scenes, they became quiet guardians of a legacy that the world had nearly lost. For Tracy, the oldest, it meant protecting his image with grace. She was already in the public eye, an actress in her own right, but she made sure interviews never turned tabloid. For Gunnar and Matthew, it meant more than just defending his name. They picked up guitars, wrote their own songs, formed the band Nelson not just as a career move but as a tribute. Their long blonde hair and harmonies echoed their father's soft-spoken style, but their message was loud. The Nelson legacy was not finished. And for Sam, the youngest, it meant holding on to memories, small, tender moments no one else saw. The way his father hummed melodies while folding laundry. The way his voice softened when he read bedtime stories. The way he seemed happiest not on stage but at home in rare quiet. The lawsuits took years. Some wins were public, like the $12.7 million Sony settlement. Others were private victories. A fair audit, a corrected credit, a royalty payment that no longer disappeared into some shadowy ledger. And through it all, the Nelson children refused to exploit their father's name. They never sold scandal. They didn't write exposés. They didn't go to the press with bitterness. They chose dignity. They chose protection. And slowly, it started to work. Fans who had drifted away came back. Younger generations discovered Ricky's music through streaming platforms. Garden Party found new life. Hello Mary Lou appeared on retro playlists. His songs, once buried under legal dust, were now being shared, sung, remembered. The estate, once drowning in debt, was now breathing again, and something deeper had shifted. Ricky Nelson wasn't just a teen idol anymore. He was seen for what he was: a pioneer, a father, a man who helped shape the sound of a generation. The fight hadn't been loud, hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it, because legacy doesn't survive by accident. It survives when someone loves you enough to fight for what you left behind. For a long time, it felt like Ricky Nelson's story had ended in sadness. Plane crash, a fractured family, an estate in debt, a career overshadowed by industry tricks and changing times. Even his final years were marked by doubt. Was he still relevant? Was the music still worth something? Would anyone remember? But nearly 4 decades after his death, something remarkable happened. The fans never left. They didn't know the lawsuits were happening. They didn't know about the accounting audits or the quiet legal filings. But they kept listening. They kept playing the songs. They told their children about Ricky Nelson. They played Poor Little Fool at weddings, Travelin' Man on long drives, and Garden Party when they needed comfort. And somewhere in that quiet loyalty, the Nelson family found their strength. By the time the final settlement with Sony came in, $12.7 million and a 36% royalty increase going forward, it wasn't just about the money. It was about validation. It was proof that Ricky's music had mattered all along, that the love his fans had felt wasn't just nostalgia. It was real. And the man who once left the stage at Madison Square Garden feeling like a failure had unknowingly created a legacy that would outlive him. It wasn't just the legal wins that brought his story full circle. It was what came after. Ricky Nelson's name began to reappear in new places. His music showed up in films, documentaries, vintage radio. Younger artists cited him as an influence. Old clips of Ozzy and Harriet began circulating online. Reminders of a simpler time, a different kind of fame, and a boy who had grown up on camera without losing his quiet sincerity. His children, once the forgotten figures in a legal battle they never asked for, were now the rightful stewards of his legacy. They didn't do it for attention. They didn't hold press conferences. They didn't ask for sympathy. They just made sure that what their father gave to the world was finally recognized. And for fans, that meant something deeper than chart positions or royalty figures. It meant closure. It meant Ricky wasn't forgotten, that he hadn't failed, that the man who had spent his life giving joy to others had finally been given peace. When word got out about the lawsuits, the settlements, the years of fighting, it didn't spark scandal. It sparked gratitude. Comment sections filled with memories. I slow danced to his songs in high school. He was my first crush. My dad played his records every Saturday morning. I still cry when I hear Lonesome Town. People who thought the world had moved on realized they hadn't, and they never would, because Ricky Nelson wasn't just a pop star or a teen idol. He was a son, a father, a quiet force in American music. And thanks to the people who loved him the most, the story didn't end in that Texas field in 1985. It ended with justice. It ended with love. It ended with fans, old and new, wiping their eyes and saying, he mattered. Ricky Nelson never got to see the impact he left behind. He didn't know that millions would still play his songs decades later, that his children, quietly and without fanfare, would spend years fighting to restore what he was owed, that fans would still speak his name with love. He died believing his legacy had slipped away, but he was wrong, because behind the scenes, his children never stopped believing in him. They carried the weight he left behind, not just the debts or the headlines, but the memories, the music, the meaning of who he really was. And they gave it back to the world, piece by piece. They didn't just recover the fortune. They recovered the man. They showed us that Ricky Nelson wasn't forgotten, that his voice still matters, that family, when it loves you enough, can keep you alive long after you're gone. And for the fans who danced to his music, who grew up watching him, who mourned him when the world moved on, this was the ending they never got. Until now, for more emotional stories, check out this video.